Inevitably, the text from your kid comes right when you're about to start presenting. Okay, so thank you guys for coming. I'm Rebecca Gettleman, and I am a junior steelhead slash spring hockey parent. And um, the event tonight is intended to be a warm up and an information session to prepare us for an incredible opportunity we have this weekend to have the folks whom I'm about to introduce you to do some workshops with our kids, age appropriate sessions to address what we have been dealing with as a community in the last 6 to 9 months with respect to suicide. Um, I have worked with the Junior Steelheads as well as CDA and spring hockey, and Lee Svangsu has been a champion of this program. And we really wanted to give parents an opportunity to hear what was going to happen on Sunday and also to just be able to ask questions and not feel like you didn't know what your kids were walking into and feel fully informed. I understand that there also may be questions that come up after the sessions on Sunday, and we want to be mindful of that and also provide opportunities for parents after the sessions too. But this is sort of the first in a series, and with that, I will let Shannon and Grace introduce themselves.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Uh, we are going to dive into the Know the Signs training this evening, talking about youth suicide prevention. I'm Shannon Decker. I'm with an organization called the Speedy Foundation, and my co-presenter is Grace Shimatsu. Grace, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Children's Home Society and just your background in the Treasure Valley.
Yeah, you bet. So, yeah, Shannon said, I'm Grace. I'm the development and fundraising manager at the Children's Home Society, which is a nonprofit organization that provides counseling services and peer groups to youth and their family members in the Treasure Valley community. I am currently a public health graduate student, and I started my career as an intern for the Speedy Foundation. And I was lucky enough to stay on after the internship for about a year as their project manager. And as I've transitioned into this new role at the Children's Home, we've continued to grow our partnership and co-brand the training that we're presenting to you tonight.
Awesome. So Grace is a wealth of knowledge, and she comes with that youth voice that is so important when we're trying to connect with young people and to truly understand and remember, put ourselves in their shoes. And I was very fortunate to still have Grace by my side last fall when Boise experienced the deaths of several young people to suicide. And so she's been at my side every step of the way. She is physically located in Boise. I am now located in Truckee, California, and I travel back to continue to do outreach and training events in Boise. The Speedy Foundation is a local nonprofit. We were founded in 2011 in memory of my cousin. His name was Jarrett Speedy Peterson. He was an Olympic skier. He was on the US ski team for 16 years and unfortunately died by suicide. He spent a lot of time in the media talking about mental health long before it was appropriate for athletes to do so. At this point in 2024, athletes are very open about the struggles they've experienced, any type of trauma that they had in childhood. There is a clear in many sports, there's a clear definition between performance and mental health, and that they're not intertwined and dependent on each other. And so I have had the opportunity to watch those changes happen in sports. In 2019, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee stood up a mental health task force, and I was one of the first advisors to that, sharing a lot of lived experience and advocating for this approach towards mental health in elite sports. So the way that I look at this is we've got grass tips and we have grassroots, and we need advocates. We need people educated along all points in order for us to bring about change. It can't just happen at the top, and it can't just happen in the community. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in this topic. And we are going to take a look. For today, we are going to talk about the signs and symptoms of somebody who might be considering suicide. We're going to talk about how to find the words to have this conversation, and our big takeaway, our key learning objective across the lifespan is that we need to be direct. We need to talk directly about suicide. We can't talk in circles or in euphemisms and just hope that people pick up what we're trying to say. We can't speak in euphemisms and hope that people really understand how much pain we're in. And then reaching out. Where do we reach out to? Who do we reach out to? What is that process? We have a couple calls to action and questions. So Know the Signs is considered a suicide prevention gatekeeper training. It was developed by Proposition 63 in the state of California as the state's suicide prevention campaign well over 10 years ago. We've been using it in Truckee in our schools, in the health classes, in the middle schools and the high schools for over 10 years. And I have been trained in a lot of other gatekeeper trainings like QPR, Talk Saves Lives, Safe Talk. There's lists of these trainings. And so we've adopted key components of that and brought it into this. But just so you're aware, there are other trainings and they are powerful. This is the most flexible so that we can modify it. We can change the words, we can change the photos, the graphics, and it still covers the same content. It's also free, and that's the reason that we're going with that with our youth. We'll talk a little bit more towards the end as to what their training will look like. But Rebecca's email should have said, I believe it said, you're encouraged to take a QPR training. We have that at no cost available on our website. It's an asynchronous learning module where it takes about 60 to 90 minutes, depending on how engaged you are, and walks you through QPR, which stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. The Idaho Department of Education has also purchased licenses for that, and programs like Hope Squad, which is a youth peer-to-peer program, is all based on QPR. So that is the gatekeeper training that we are teaching youth who are engaged in Hope Squad. So that is our agenda for today. There will be time for questions. If you have questions that come up at this time, I would encourage you to put it in the chat, and hopefully we already have it covered and we will get to it, but if not, we will get back to that at the end. So suicide is preventable, and it's also incredibly complex. So when we're looking at the methods in which people die in our country, suicide is one of the most preventable forms of death. However, there's no one solution. There's no one preventable, cure that we know of at this time. And so it's a very complex problem that we need to develop mental health literacy around. We need to destigmatize the topic so that we can address it more fully, so that we remove the fear and the shame and the pain. What we do know is that suicide derives from unbearable pain or unsolvable problems. So if we can help someone alleviate their pain or solve their problems, that's suicide prevention in a nutshell. And anyone can do that across the lifespan, across any relationship. It just takes talking about it. It takes ripping off the Band-Aid one time and changing the culture of communities, of states, of our nation. Suicide rates around the world have been growing, but this really is a US-based problem, kind of like the opioid crisis. That is a US-based problem. The suicide epidemic is very strong in the United States, whereas in other countries, while it can be a problem, it's being addressed, means are being restricted, and prevention is occurring. So we'll talk more about some of those contributing factors throughout. But to kind of gauge what's happening, we're going to look at some data. And I recognize that most of us have been touched by suicide at some point in our life. And my heart goes out to you. I come at this with lived experience. having lost my very close friend from high school the summer that we graduated to suicide, and have lost several friends since then. We all attended high school in Boise, and it was really difficult to continue to see your classmates dying by suicide and this radiating silence around the topic. We all came from a religious background. We attended Bishop Kelly, and we didn't have the support and the open dialogue in that religious faith. And so when we look at these numbers, I just want to highlight that we are talking about people who have been lost to suicide, and that this is very tragic. But if we can understand it, we can work to prevent it. So looking at the United States, one thing you need to know about suicide and deaths of despair is that our data is old. So this is some of the provisional data that was released in 2023. Data does not get finalized until later on in the years. It takes about 2 years to finalize everything. But in the United States, suicide was the 11th leading cause of death. Prior to COVID, it was in the top 10, typically the 10th. In 2022, we lost nearly 50,000 Americans to suicide. And for each person who dies by suicide, there is an estimate that about 25 people attempt suicide. And so we're dealing with a lot of silent disease, a lot of silent mental health, a lot of unsolvable problems and unbearable pain. When we look at the state of Idaho, this graphic comes from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So in our state, suicide is the second leading cause of death for individuals 10 to 24 and 25 to 34, and the third leading cause of death for ages 35 to 44. Out of all 50 states, Idaho ranked 12th in 2021 for having the highest suicide rate. There are years when Idaho's in the top 5, top 10. There is a geography connection throughout the Rocky Mountains. All of the states throughout the Rocky Mountains have incredibly high suicide rates. That includes Alaska. And the contributing factors for that has a lot to do with social isolation, lack of access to healthcare, or the stigmatization of accessing mental health care. It also has a lot to do with our access and culture around firearms. In Idaho, 68% of all suicides were with firearms, and 85% of all firearm deaths were suicide. In media, it is often projected that firearms are used in homicides, which can be true, but it's really the silent piece that firearms are contributing to suicide at a much higher rate, especially in these rural states. Another piece that's really important to understand is Dr. Thomas Joyner's theory of suicidality. So Dr. Joyner believes that a person builds a desire for suicide when they have a thwarted belongingness. They feel like they're all alone and that they don't belong. This, when contributed with perceived burdensomeness, where they feel like they're a burden to others, is where that desire comes from. And if you've never had the desire to end your life, like I've never had this strong desire, it's really hard for me to understand how a person could feel that way. We know that, around age 7, around age 8, people are starting to really acknowledge, this concept of life and death. It is living and non-living is a kindergarten learning standard. So they're contemplating what keeps me alive. But when the feeling starts to come up that there would be a benefit to me not being here, a sociological benefit to my family or my friends, that is the piece that we really need to understand. This can happen when people are surrounded by groups that love and adore them. So when I think about Speedy, who was a family member, when he died, we talked about how he had already started sharing his story, and he was very open about the struggles that he experienced. And so we decided as family and friends to continue to share his story. But when we look at this theory through that lens, he felt alone in struggling with mental health issues for so long, and looking and seeing that no one else was struggling in the same way from his perspective. He also felt like he was a burden to his friends, to his teammates, to his significant others. And that wasn't necessarily true. He did have a lot of behaviors that were really hard to deal with, but the burdensomeness is that internalized piece. And so a person can live that way. There are suicide prevention advocates who talk about living in that little Venn diagram piece, and really never progressing, never establishing suicide plans, because it's not until they build up capacity for suicide where they're not afraid to die. And when that happens, that's when we have a suicide or a near lethal attempt. Dr. Thomas Joyner, we met with him last week. We brought about 20 researchers together, sat them down at a table, and we said, what is happening in research? Where is the disconnect between that and the general population and our foundations? And so he suggested that we take researchers that are at all these different universities, working with him and these other theorists, and start embedding them. But if you are looking for a really dry read to put you to sleep, I suggest you check out Dr. Joyner's books. He's also done a lot on active shooters and that connection. So just to point out, this is a piece that we talk about with high school students sometimes if they are really in depth with suicide prevention, but this is not going to be a portion of the presentation for students this weekend. So we think of suicide prevention as a little bit of a cycle. We have prevention where we're promoting resilience, we're promoting protective factors and encouraging help-seeking. Intervention comes in when someone is struggling and we start to pick up on the signs and the symptoms that they're not doing well. We're going to ask direct questions, we're going to provide resources and referrals, and then we're going to limit access to lethal means. It's very important that we talk directly about how people end their lives, and that we talk about it openly with other people. We are asking, do you have any firearms in your home if a young person is going to be spending time in that home? So we have to talk about these intervention level pieces as well. And postvention is, unfortunately, when we do lose someone or following an attempt that someone makes, we need to provide support and guidance. We need to mitigate the negative effects following a tragedy like that, and encourage safe reporting in the media to make sure that we're not sensationalizing this. We do have some really robust postvention materials that were developed last fall that really look at contagion and cluster suicides that come into play in smaller communities through sports groups, through school groups, through rural communities. So if you're interested in those, we can definitely pass that along or go in more depth in the future. But this is a cycle, and some of the best prevention work that we can do in suicide prevention comes from postvention. That is really where there's that fire, that kick, and an investment to get going. So I'm going to pass things over to Grace.
Okay, so risk factors for suicide. So risk factors are factors that are associated with a higher likelihood for a negative outcome. So the presence of these factors does not mean that a person is going to die by suicide, but it does mean that there may be a potentially higher risk for suicide. So individual level risk factors include a previous suicide attempt, a mental or physical illness, social isolation and loneliness, experiencing legal or financial problems, having impulsive or aggressive tendencies, experiencing job problems or job loss, and substance use disorder. Relationship level risk factors include bullying, sexual violence, ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse or neglect, so any form of childhood trauma experienced, and relationship problems such as a breakup, violence, or a loss of a relationship. And this doesn't necessarily have to be romantic relationships, but any kind of relationship, whether that's grieving the loss of a family member, a friend, or a romantic relationship. Community level factors, include barriers to healthcare, so a lack of health insurance or a stigma around accessing mental health services, cultural and religious beliefs, and a suicide cluster in the community, which Shannon just spoke to. But when one suicide happens in the community, can sometimes set off this contagion of other suicides, and that is a risk factor. And lastly, societal level factors include the stigma that's associated oftentimes with mental illness or seeking help for mental illness, having easy access to lethal means, and unsafe media portrayals of suicide. So when we see this um, glorification of suicide in the media, or inappropriate language used to discuss suicide on news outlets or social media and movies.
And I'll just chime in really quick here that that unsafe media portrayals following Robin Williams' death by suicide, the way that it was covered in the news led to really increased numbers of suicide attempts and completed suicides. We have worked with the Idaho Suicide Prevention Hotline to put together media training. So if safe messaging is of interest to you, we've put together all of the best practices and examples. We know that a lot of high school journalism classes and college level journalism classes have been using that as a resource to just understand how do we cover it respectfully and responsibly without sensationalizing it. And I think another piece that plays in here, several years ago, there was a Netflix series called 13 Reasons Why that was really misleading about death by suicide. It was this narrative of a teen who ended her life, and she was looking back and listing the 13 different reasons why she did that and how she was going to be getting revenge on these people or on these situations. And that's not reality. Like, that's fiction. And when someone dies, you know, they are gone. And so by portraying it like that, there was a huge spike in the attempts, and our hospitals were packed with kids, especially in the Boise area. So those are some examples where, as a society, we have some responsibility. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So protective factors for suicide are the opposite of risk factors. They're associated with a lower likelihood for a negative outcome. So when these factors are present, they can potentially decrease the risk for suicide. These factors include having effective clinical care for mental, physical, and substance use disorders, and also having easy access and reduced barriers to this care, to clinical interventions and support, having family and community support, that sense of connectedness, that social isolation and loneliness is a really important risk factor, especially among teens and our youth. So having that sense of connectedness and community is a really important protective factor. Feeling supported by medical and mental health care professionals, problem solving, conflict resolution, and nonviolent ways of handling disputes. It's definitely a protective factor to have effective coping strategies and conflict resolution skills. And cultural and religious beliefs that discourage suicide. So while some cultural and religious beliefs may act as risk factors, there's also some that act as protective factors. In some cultures, suicide is heavily, and religion, suicide is heavily discouraged, and that can act as a protective factor. Having one and hopefully more trusted adults in your life, and constructive recreation.
Don't know why we bounced back. Give me just 1 second. All right. All right, constructive recreation. Awesome. So there are some personal factors that really protect against that suicide risk. So effective coping and problem solving skills are absolutely learned through constructive recreation, through sports and teamwork, through amazing coaching and family support. People develop their reasons for living, their purpose. They find that through their teammates and their family and their friends and their pets. But that comes through sports. or it can come through sports. And then having that strong sense of cultural identity. There are so many people who identify through the sports that they play. And it doesn't have to be every part of them, but it's definitely a piece of their identity. And that is protection. So, for athletes, we want to think about using strategies to support them, their mental health in sport, building a support network, practicing self care and stress management through school and through competition and training, setting realistic goals, using mental health resources and techniques to cope with pressure and expectations, finding ways to reduce performance anxiety, and not to let that performance anxiety kind of dictate everything in sports. We do see, sometimes people will get to that elite level and they are just really riding on performance anxiety to get there. So learning tools to cope and build a balanced life in sport, seeking professional help when it's necessary, and really just learning that balance between sports and life. Always having a transition plan, always having, something else that you're passionate about in this balanced life approach. In 2019, the International Olympic Committee put forth some recommendations to ensure sport. So when we're talking about the grass tips and the grassroots, like this is how the grassroots can start to identify the things that will be happening at the grass tips. But the work that we did throughout COVID with the mental health task force for the Olympic Committee was the first time that had ever happened at that level. So I know that if, we sent the swimming team to the Olympics and they had never gone with a crisis plan, they'd never gone with a mental health practitioner. I mean, we sent 2 mental health practitioners for all of the athletes. But it's new, it's brand new. And when you go to Google and you type in National Hockey League mental health, the stories that you're going to see are really new. There's a lot of new initiatives that have happened in January of 24. There's a lot of powerful athletes who are speaking out and sharing their stories to bring about these changes. So when I go to the US ski team, which I have a meeting with them tomorrow to figure out what we're doing for training this year, this is what we look to. How are we screening for mental health disorders and not penalizing athletes that screen positive? How do we get them connected to treatment? How do we destigmatize help-seeking behavior? How do we create the subculture of positive, supportive environments? And my passion is education, empowerment and education of athletes, coaches, and stakeholders. Education is power. I taught in the West Ada School District for a number of years before transitioning to Reno. That's the power of this. So thank you guys so much for bringing education to your athletes. Let's talk about some of the signs. These are the signs that we need to be cautious of. We're going to see things in mood that get changed. It could be uncontrolled anger. It could be somebody who's talking about seeking revenge. It could be somebody who's uncharacteristically sad or depressed. It could be somebody who's hostile or bitter. They have resentment, they have rage. Or it could be somebody whose mood changes. They are unusually happy or content after a period of really struggling. That could indicate that they have come to like a resolution that ending their life is going to end that unsolvable problem or that unbearable pain. And they feel relief in knowing that decision and setting forth to put together that plan. So I know that for some parents that are, living with teens who are struggling or young people who are struggling, there is this like sudden change. And I'm not saying this, to destroy any hope, but it doesn't mean, to take your finger off the pulse of what's going on, because it could be that they've come to a decision. These are some of the mood changes that are really alarming. There's hundreds of other signs for mood changes, but when we are talking about young people and athletes specifically, these are some of the most crucial mood changes to look at. And then there's changes in behavior. They might be acting recklessly. They might be spending money recklessly. There could be an increase in alcohol or drug use. There could be social withdrawal or isolation. There could be a lack of interest in activities that they once enjoyed, and they might be sleeping more or less than usual. So when we are looking through a psychological autopsy lens at a young person who has died by suicide, sleep is this behavior change that is always glaring, that they were really struggling with sleep, or they were sleeping all the time. Another piece would be that loss of activities that they once enjoyed. So we know that it's typical adolescent behavior to, get into a relationship and to not participate in the choir anymore, and maybe put all of your focus into competitive soccer. That's pretty typical, and maybe not the healthiest thing, and maybe not what everybody wants somebody doing, but that's typical teenage behavior. What's not typical is for there to be a complete withdrawal. There's no relationships, there's no time being spent with friends, and they've dropped, any type of soccer. They're not interested. They didn't replace it with something else, like, I want to try out for the spring play, or I want to go get a job. So these are some of those big changes in behavior that we want to really take a look at. The expressions of hopelessness and despair. Anytime that someone is talking about not having a purpose, being a burden, not being able to see a way out of their current situation. And we know that adolescent mind, the developing frontal cortex, they need help. They need modeling on problem solving. But for some people where they feel like they've been faced with the same problem over and over again, and knowing that the teenager's timeline of life is nothing compared to our timeline of historical experiences in our own life, they can see that as a very hopeless and desperate situation. There are statements that life is pointless, or they couldn't see how life could improve. So those are all expressions we really need to take. And all of these things are, smoke signals. If we think of ourselves as a smoke detector and we're getting these signals, we're getting this gut feeling, like these are invitations that people are putting out there that we need to talk about this. It's something that might be an uncomfortable conversation, but whether it's suicide or anything else, it deserves a conversation. Another sign is putting prized possessions in order, giving away passwords to social media, gaming personas. Technology comes into play here, whereas generations before, that wasn't necessarily a thing. I can also say that using that psychological autopsy research piece, when we're looking at young people who have died by suicide or after a suicide attempt, there's oftentimes moments where they have been grounded from their cell phones. And when we think about discipline growing up, I know that I was often grounded from the phone. I couldn't talk to my friends because I had a sassy mouth and a behavior problem, but that's different. At this point in life, these cell phones are everything. It's not just being grounded from the phone. And so there's a lot of technology hygiene that we need to improve upon instead of just cutting people off completely. That's a cutoff from their entire lifeline. And so if that's something that is ever coming up, it would be something to talk to school professionals, mental health professionals, a parenting coach to help put up some guardrails instead of a complete elimination. But when we see a young person who has that significant change in personality, they lost interest in the things they previously enjoyed, they're neglecting their personal hygiene, and it's more than just the throwback to the 90s that seems to be happening with kids right now. The grunge style is back. So it's more than that. The complaints of the physical pain, because it's so often related to emotional pain. When they've got anxiety and their somatic experiences, stomach aches and headaches and migraines, those are signs. The critical warning signs, again, if these come up, this is immediate help. If they're talking about death or suicide, it could be a vague statement, it could be direct. It could be, my parents will be better off when I'm gone, or it could be, I'm planning to end my life. It could be something they've written down or they've posted on social media. These are critical signs that need action. If they're seeking methods for self-harm, they could be seeking guns or stockpiling pills. This is a critical sign. Our smoke detector is going off. They might be talking about feeling hopeless or having no reason to live. being a burden to others. So that's where we're going to work on finding the words. How do we have this conversation? Grace.
Yeah, so you've noticed these signs in your youth. What do you do next? How do you find the words and how do you have this conversation? So there's three main steps, and we'll get into more detail on each of them. But we're going to start the conversation, listen, express our concern, and provide reassurance, and get help. So before the conversation even starts, there's a few things you want to do to prepare to have the conversation. So the first step is to be prepared. So you can start by compiling a list of helpful resources that you might intend to share with the person, and also compile some specific examples that you have to share with them. That third bullet point, prepare specific examples of the behavior that you've noticed and the reasons why you're concerned. And plan to have the conversation at an appropriate time. So time where you won't be rushed, where you have an adequate amount of time to spend with the person, and also at an appropriate time in their life. So not right before a major event. Maybe they have a big game later that day, or a big practice that night, or a test in the morning. And this is a potentially very emotionally charged conversation. So we want to just make sure that we're having it at a time that's appropriate. During the conversation, mention the signs that prompted you to ask about suicide. For example, you could say, I've noticed that you've been sleeping a lot more than usual. You haven't been interested in the normal activities, and you haven't been wanting to hang out with your friends as much. Is everything okay? Specific examples like this that show why you're concerned demonstrates to this person that you care enough about them to notice when something seems wrong. And it also makes it clear to them that you're not just asking them out of the blue, which is going to make it more difficult for them to deny that something's going on and something's bothering them. And next, ask directly about suicide. It's a very common misconception that if we ask about suicide, if we talk about suicide, it's going to put the idea in someone's mind. This is a myth. This is absolutely not the case. In some cases, talking about suicide can actually provide a sense of relief, and it's really important that we ask these questions directly. First, it lets the person know that we're willing to talk about suicide with them and that we're a safe person that's willing and open to having this conversation. And it also establishes that we're talking about the same thing. So, for example, you could say, sometimes when people feel that way, they're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? Or are you thinking of ending your life? And these are things that it can be helpful to practice saying them out loud. I know working in suicide prevention, I know what I'm supposed to say. And so I think it will be easy to say when I'm having a conversation with a loved one. And then I get in the moment and it's an emotional conversation and it's hard to get the word out. And so before the conversation, I think I find it personally really helpful to practice saying it in the mirror or with a partner, with a friend. It's a good way to prepare because it can be difficult.
Just to chime in, if we were in person sitting next to each other, we'd take a pause. We would turn to our partner and we would look each other in the eye and ask this question out loud, not as a role play, but just as muscle memory to practice saying it. So, at some point, if you've never had this opportunity to say these words out loud, when you're alone and nobody's going to hear you, look in the mirror and practice saying this, just so that you can have the experience of saying it at least once. And I also just want to acknowledge that sometimes things come out wrong. Sometimes there's nervous laughter. And at any point, we can always say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to sound like that, or I didn't say it the way I intended. You can always take a pause and apologize if it doesn't come out exactly as you wished it to.
Hey guys, this is Rebecca. I've heard you say before, comment on the question, are you planning on hurting yourself? Are you going to address that? Because it was really powerful. Sure. If you're going to address it anyway, just go ahead.
Yes.
Can't remember if the slide. Is it in here, Grace?
Yes.
Okay.
In just perfect. A couple of slides.
Okay. Perfect. So if the answer is yes, we want to figure out the level of risk. How far along is this? Is this just an abstract thought, or is this something that they've really started to plan? So we can ask follow-up questions and notice how they're pretty vague. Like, do you have a plan to kill yourself? Have you decided how you do it? And do you have everything you need to carry it out? I'm not asking specifically, like, are you going to kill yourself today? Do you have pills that you're hiding someplace? These are open-ended questions to really gauge this person's level of like, just crisis. Where are they at? We can listen, we can express concern, and then we can reassure them. We want to listen to the reasons the person has for both living and dying. And hearing someone's reasons for dying can be unsettling. We're not here to talk them out of them. We know that suicide is not really the underlying issue. Like, this is a symptom of something else that's going on. It could be a diagnosable mental health condition. It could be trauma. It could be just really these unsolvable problems or unbearable pain that they have. And so we're not trying to talk them out of everything. We want to keep them alive for now. And by listening to reasons for living and reasons for dying, validating that they are considering both of those options, highlighting that living is still an option, really going back and highlighting the small things about life. There is a suicide prevention advocate. Her name is Allie, and she has this program called Find Your Anchor. And there's these little boxes that she's put together. She's a graphic designer. And they're things that, like, these are her reasons for living. When she has been suicidal, following suicide attempts, being in the hospital, what are the small things that were just her anchors to life? We need to highlight those. And so she has a deck of cards in there. And one of the cards is like, my first car, thinking about your first car, thinking about hiking to Table Rock, thinking about fly fishing in the Boise River. Small things, small moments like that is something that can resonate with you and help to recreate that purpose for being here. While we're having this conversation, we let them know that you care, with genuine empathetic listening. And we let them know that you are taking this conversation very seriously.
Throughout the entirety of the conversation, it's really important that we're focusing on safety. We can do this by asking the person if they have access to lethal means, and ensuring that they don't. If they have access to firearms, maybe making suggestions as to how we can remove them for the time being. This doesn't have to be a permanent situation, but while the person is in crisis and at risk, making them as safe as possible. It can also look like removing them from the vicinity if necessary. And if you need help, don't be afraid to get it from others, including law enforcement. And lastly, never put yourself in danger. And if you are worried about your own safety, remove yourself from the situation and call 911.
And again, we looked at the statistics for firearms and suicide, and we need parents to remove firearms from the house when things are turbulent. If you haven't had to use firearms for protecting your property within the past year, you're not going to need them while your child or a family member is in crisis. So that's a cultural change that really has to modify in the Idaho area in order to improve our rates of living on through crisis.
Right. So what are some things that we really want to avoid and not say during this conversation? So first is, don't ask in a way that indicates you want no for an answer. So for example, this would be saying something like, "You're not thinking of killing yourself, are you?" So instead of letting this person know that they can talk about suicide with you, this sends them a message that you're actually not comfortable talking about suicide, or that that you might dismiss their thoughts if they are thinking about suicide and they bring this up to you. So very important that we ask directly. Don't ask in an ambiguous way. It's important to ask directly because suicide is about life and death. So this is what Rebecca brought up earlier, the importance of not asking just merely about harming yourself. So harming yourself can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it doesn't directly let you know whether or not suicide is involved. So, for example, if you ask someone if they're thinking of harming themselves, they might say no, and that might be because they're not thinking of harming themselves. They're thinking of killing themselves. And in their mind, that is going to put an end to their pain. That's not going to cause them any pain. And so they might respond no to that. And that doesn't let you know whether suicide is involved. So that's, again, why it's extremely important that we ask directly. Don't promise secrecy. Holding this type of information a secret is going to do nothing to help the person with the thoughts that they're experiencing. When someone's life is at risk, safety is a lot more important than them being upset with you. So instead of promising them secrecy, you can promise discretion, thoughtfulness, and involved decision making. For example, I care about you too much to keep a secret like this. You need help, and I'm here to help you. I think this is especially relevant when we're talking about youth and friends who may express that they're having thoughts of suicide to another friend. They say, well, don't tell anyone. I'm experiencing these thoughts, but I don't want you to tell anyone else. Promising secrecy does nothing to help the person, and we want to make sure that they know that. And lastly, the worst thing that you could possibly do in this situation is to encourage them to do it. So while you may feel frustrated or angry, this is the most dangerous thing to say. Okay, so now that we've had the conversation, how do we reach out and connect this person to resources and help? So the first step can be to create a safety plan. So a safety plan is a list of coping strategies and safe people that this person has identified and can use to help de-escalate a crisis. So on this safety plan, the person identifies red flags, things that come up that is kind of like a signal for them to know that something's not right. I'm not feeling well. Red flags, coping strategies, emergency contacts, close friends and family contacts, harm reduction strategies, and those reasons to continue living. We create a safety plan because it's a form of intervention, and it uses a brief, easy to read format that's in the person's own words. This is really helpful because it can help the person to feel a sense of control over their suicidal thoughts, because they've identified their warning signs. They know coping strategies and the people to go to help keep them safe in crisis. So they feel a sense of control when these crises do occur. You can think of it like a necessary precaution that's similar to a fire drill or emergency escape plan. It might not actually be needed, but in the times that it is, it's an extremely important tool to have.
To chime in on safety planning, it is an evidence-based tool. It was created by Dr. Barbara Stanley and Dr. Brown. And there's various formats. There's apps that are out there where you can share it with different people. The VA uses it for folks in the military. The one that we just had a photo of was one that we created, and we used layperson language. So we made it less clinical. And it can be used upstream. Like, these are all questions that really we should have answers to before we're ever in crisis. But it's vital that after following a crisis, as somebody is de-escalating and they're being reintroduced to life, that they have these in their pocket, and that they're sharing them with their support teams. So I know that using Speedy's story, Speedy had 2 suicide attempts, and both of them were required hospitalization. And he was checked out from the hospital without any type of safety planning. And there was a lot of secrecy that was used. There were people throughout his the US ski team who knew what had happened, and they didn't show up to support. They wrote letters and just very secretly gave them to him that said, don't tell anyone else, but I've also struggled, or I've found sobriety. And this is different. I was on a safety planning team for a friend in a mental health crisis a couple months ago, and So she, knowing my background, said, I want Shannon to come in for the planning before she was released from the hospital. And we brought her pastor in as well. And so she had this team, aside from her significant other and her family, who knew what was going on and can check in on the safety plan. She was diagnosed with cancer very recently. And so we brought out the safety plan again and said, how are we feeling on all of this stuff? It's a whole new level of mental health when you've got this, physical health piece on top of it. So a safety plan isn't something that's meant to be prepared and put into a school file. It's a living, breathing document, and it needs to be used to create safety within the support team for a person.
When possible, a safety plan should be developed following a full suicide risk assessment. It should be written down, whether that's on paper or on an app, so that it can be looked to when needed. It should be assessed for likelihood of use and be adapted to fit the needs of the individual. It should adopt a collaborative problem solving stance that engages the individual. It should be built with the individual. They should be an active part of creating and building this plan. And lastly, it should not be developed for individuals who are at imminent risk of suicide. Next, connect them to trained helpers. So the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is the new 3-digit dialing code for suicidal crisis or emotional distress. So this lifeline used to be a big long phone number that no one could remember, and now it's just 3 digits, 988. This number is available nationwide 24/7. You can call it, you can text it, you can chat. You will be connected to a trained crisis counselor who is going to make sure that you're safe and then help you to de-escalate the situation, alleviate the crisis, and connect you to referrals and support if needed. I also want to point out that 988 is not just for people experiencing an active suicidal crisis. It's also for you as parents who need help navigating these situations. If your child's in a crisis, maybe you're in a crisis, you need advice. It's for any kind of emotional distress. So you don't need to actively be experiencing suicidal thoughts to call. I recommend maybe calling 988 and listening to the voicemail. This is something that the hotline always recommends, to just dial, and before you're connected to anyone, just listen to the process and what they say so that you feel comfortable with it, so that if you ever need to call, you kind of know what to expect already, and then just hang up before you get someone. Yeah, and there's different dial codes you can dial. So 1 is for veteran and service member crisis lifeline, 2 is for Spanish, and then 3 is specialized support for LGBTQ plus 25 and under. But individuals over the age of 25, you will not be disconnected from it.
Awesome. And I am just looking at the time. I think Grace and I could talk about suicide prevention for hours. So I know that we're close on time. I am going to send you these lists of warm lines and teen lines and helplines and other national organizations that have great resources. But we do have some calls to action. So as we wrap tonight,
Shannon.
oh, yeah.
So appreciate the calls to action. I want to also provide a space for the parents who are here to ask questions of you guys that,
Yes.
About what Sunday will look like,
Yes.
concerns they have, things they hope that we cover. I realize the time is short, but if anyone, attended this because are anticipating a Sunday with concern, nervousness, and want to have these guys, want to ask a question, I think it would be important to provide that opportunity.
Absolutely. So again, here are some calls to action. These are specifically for parents to take action with their young people. We will be doing the training with the U14s on Sunday morning at 8:45, the U16s at 10, and the U12s, U10s at 11:15. So what kinds of questions do you guys have about the training or the specific training, today's training, or specifically Sunday's training?
So feel free to just take yourself off mute and start talking. If you don't, I'm going to ask some questions.
And if you'd like, I can stop recording it and we can just have a conversation that's not being recorded.
Sounds good. So while we wait for someone else to talk, can you tell us how Sunday will differ from what you've just done for us adults? Because I know that there's an interactive component, and I'm sure that there are folks who are wondering how 12 U's versus 16 U's might different. Can you be specific about what you intend to give the group this weekend that may be different than what we just did?
Yes. So since we'll be together in person, it's going to be a lot less of a lecture and a lot more of a conversation. So we are going to talk about, that we're here to talk about some of the hardest things that people experience in life, and that if we can talk about that, we can talk about anything. We're going to start with some conversations, asking, for people to share what are the hard things that we do experience in life, in their school life or in their sports life, and who are the trusted adults that they go to. And we're going to talk about knowing signs to look out for that a friend might be struggling, being able to come up with the words to have a sometimes really uncomfortable conversation, and then who to reach out to. How do we navigate help? So it's not going to be about building safety plans or Dr. Joyner's theory or data. It's going to be, what are the things that are really hard in life? And what do you guys have within your world to navigate those types of pieces? And let me share a couple more with you. Let's talk about 988 and how it can be used. The same way we learned how to use 911 when we were 4 years old or 5 years old and we memorized our address. We have 988 so that if you're having an emotional crisis, that you can call, you can text 24/7. It's free, it's anonymous, and it's a listening ear. So those will be some of the big differences. The U14s and the U16s are going to have more lived experience. They're going to have different vocabulary. And so suicide isn't a dirty word, but the language will be just a little bit less bold and strong. Suicide prevention is encouraged for everyone age 12 and up, and for under age 12, it's still encouraged. It's just not necessarily something that is put into the standards of basic education. So in the right group, in the right setting, it's appropriate. This training, these components of the training are the same throughout all the gatekeepers. And they're things that are done with individuals one-on-one or in small groups when you're under age 10.
So I did see one person.
Shannon,
go.
Yeah, I have a quick question. My son is currently U16, but played on a U18 team this year, and obviously is moving to U18 next year. Is he to be included in that U16 time
So
frame?
I can answer that question. So we basically tried to split up into three groups of young, medium, and older. And so we will, for folks who are 18, they will be in the U16 group. I also got the question today, do we do the 2023-24 or do we do the next fall? We're going by the fall's age group because that's how spring hockey has split things up. So
Right.
you will be in the fall age group. If you happen to be older than a 16U, please join that group. If I get a lot of feedback that there are a lot of older folks and we feel like we need to split it up further, we have some days to work on that. But in general, we wanted young, medium, and older. So hopefully that feels comfortable to folks.
Okay, perfect. I'll pass that on to our team as well, just in case they have any of those questions.
And feel free to email me to get more specific. Like if you feel there's a big group of 18Us who've had a certain experience, we want to be able to accommodate that. So feel free to reach out to me individually.
Okay, perfect. I appreciate your time.
Does anyone else have, that's a great question. Does anyone else have specific concerns or things you're anticipating thinking about your kid being in this discussion on Sunday?
Hey, Rebecca, this is Andrea. I just have a question, not necessarily about my kid, but knowing what's happened in our hockey community in the state over the last year. And if there's been thought given, I assume there has, but to specifically some of those kids who might be here, who experienced that firsthand on the team, and if there's anything special for them.
So I'll just, before I ask Shannon and Grace to chime in, we reached out as junior steelheads and then eventually as spring hockey and CDA to these guys, because the Speedy Foundation, because of what our community has endured. And I think it's a good question whether, we're going to get into specifics or whether we're going to be general. And, Grace and Shannon, how you work differently when you're working in a postvention, as you call it, like specifically with a community that has suffered a loss yesterday or last week or last month or this season. Um, we haven't talked about how that's going to go when there are folks in the group who are specifically in that category. Do you guys want to take that on? I think Andrea asked a great question.
Yes, absolutely. So when the young person in Blaine County attempted suicide, we reached out and we were told that there was no need for additional support at this time. And then when he passed away, I know that our some of our board members sent the family some resources and support, but that's as much as I know about the situation. So when it comes to postvention, I guess I'm looking to kind of know what your known impact is on that situation. But we'll be starting, the conversation by saying, that a lot of us have been touched by suicide, whether it's a distant family member, close family member, a classmate, somebody in sports or somebody that we looked up to. We've been touched by this, and it can hurt. And so this is a great time to share any feedback where, there might be some very specific um, athletes who have been impacted, and that we can create the space for doing that in looking at maybe postvention first, and how do we take care of ourselves? How do we make ourselves understand, where this person was coming from? And then look to the prevention and the intervention pieces of suicide prevention moving forward.
I mean, one thing I hear Andrea saying is the conversation could turn in a direction that is not hypothetical,
Mm-hmm.
that is very real and now. And I trust you guys. I mean, your experience is wide and deep, and so I trust that you can navigate that. But I think we all need to appreciate that the conversation could very easily go there.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that athlete, he was a U16, correct? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that we can kind of frame it that way. I know that, when we're working with young people in school settings and they've lost a classmate, it's best practice to wait 3 to 6 months before going in to do any type of prevention training. It's all that postvention, that grief response. And so even when we do that in a school setting, there are going to be teens that are just not engaged with that personal experience. And then there's going to be ones who are really impacted, even though they've never said anything, even though they were never connected to that person, they never met them, or they knew them distantly. When we look at contagion, we know that those who are closest are usually pretty protected. But as we expand through the social settings, those social connections, that there's rippling effects, and that those kids, of people across the lifespan, can be impacted. So we could definitely frame the conversation in more of a starting with postvention response for that older group of kids, whereas with the middle and the younger, maybe starting more with the preventative piece, and just being prepared that if anyone were to bring it up, or want to talk about it afterwards, that we'll be prepared to have that conversation. I know that we won't be using Speedy's story to sensationalize this. I went to a private school training recently with an NHL. I'm trying to remember his name. He lives in Nevada, but he attempted suicide with a gun and has X-rays. So he puts the X-rays up and just uses shock and awe to like try to scare people out of it. So that will not be the look or feel of our training. We'll be using many of these slides just in a different order, with a little bit of language tweaks.
The other thing
I wanted
the other thing that this group that we talked about before everyone came on is that, there may be questions that come up after the training. You guys may get kids coming home talking about stuff, and Shannon and Grace are committed to being a resource afterwards. We actually talked about potentially holding another parent session afterwards, and I haven't gotten there because we just thought of that, but we realize that you may have more questions than answers after Sunday when your kids come home. And so whether it's me or Shannon and Grace, we'd like to keep the dialogue going and be available for people as a resource. It looks like there are chat items here. Oh, that's you. Okay.
That's me. So I just threw in some items in the chat. On April 18th, we're bringing up Dr. Kevin Skinner. He is the clinical director of a Utah-based organization called parentguidance.org. He is going to be coming up and doing a clinical professional development for us on the 18th, and then there will be a parent night that's hosted at South Junior High with the Boise School District. So it's all about attachment and suicide prevention as a family resource. So that would be maybe an action item, or maybe a continuing piece. The other thing, just to plug, there is a book called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, and it is amazing. I've been listening to it on an audiobook, but there's a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of articles that are coming out right now about moving from this screen-based childhood to real-life childhood. So if this is something that you're passionate about, I highly recommend taking a look at that. And then the other piece, I did put in some resources, just a little PDF, because I kind of breezed through those slides. But there is a letter that is being circulated to the Boise School District. So if your children are in that district, this is something that maybe you'll want to take a look at. There's about 230 parents who have signed on to this, but they are advocating for appropriate technology use, adopting a peer-to-peer support suicide prevention program like Hope Squad, authentic connections to the outdoors, and modified school start times. So that's in the chat, and then Rebecca, I'll email it to you so that you can share it out.
And Shannon, if folks who attended tonight, I know it's a hard hour to be here. My daughter keeps asking me when we're eating, and also short notice and everything. If folks who attended tonight want to tell their friends, co-parent, other parents, we recorded tonight, and I'll figure out how to get forward along the recording. But please, if you feel this is valuable and other parents who might appreciate the opportunity to listen to this before Sunday or at any time, we'll pass that along. And I want it to be available for those who couldn't attend tonight as well.
Yes.
Anything else? I'll give you guys 15 seconds to jump in.
My email's in the chat as well. You can reach out and I can answer any questions that you have or schedule some time to chat. Yeah, I can imagine that it could be, a little bit scary to have this conversation for some families. But I think it's an important first step, and that it can just change the culture so that this just becomes something that's commonplace, and that mental and emotional safety is something that we're just not intimidated by anymore.
And logistically, guys, this event is happening at the time of spring hockey, which is where the times and the ages came from. If you're not doing spring hockey, if you're junior steelheads or other, just show up at the rink at the times that we said, and we'll try and direct you to the right place. But the timing is such that, there aren't junior steelheads practices going on, but we really do want the whole community to be welcome, even though it's dovetailing with spring hockey. Thank you, everybody, so much. Take care.
Thank you.